The heat in Macon, Georgia clung to everything that afternoon. The sky hung low, the kind of thick southern summer sky that felt like it was watching. Derek Rowe eased his rental car down Pine Street just a few blocks from his mother's house. On the seat beside him sat a grocery bag milk bread and her favorite lemon cookies. It had been nearly a year since he had come home. Life in Seattle kept him busy, corporate meetings, travel, deadlines, but he hadn't forgotten the rhythm of this place. The familiar cracked sidewalks, the worn-out porches, the steady quiet of a neighborhood that raised him. He glanced in the rearview mirror. A patrol car had been following him for a while, 5 blocks now. He turned it on his blinker, shifted lanes, hoping it would pass. It didn't. Red and blue lights flashed behind him, followed by the brief chirp of a siren. Derek let out a slow sigh. "Here we go," he murmured, pulling over calmly to the side of the road. The driver's door of the cruiser opened, and out stepped a white officer, mid-40s with short blonde hair, pulled into a tight bun. Her name tag read K. Delacroix. She had the kind of stiff, practiced posture that told you she'd been doing this a long time and expected obedience. "License and registration," she said flatly, one hand resting near her holster. Derek kept his hands visible. "Sure," he said, voice steady. "I'm reaching into my glove box nice and slow. Make it quick," she replied. He handed over the documents. "What brings you to this side of town?" she asked, eyeing the out-of-state plates. "My mother lives just down the street," he said. "I flew in from Seattle yesterday." She paused just a moment too long. "Step out of the vehicle." Derek blinked. "I'm sorry." "Out! Of the car," she repeated more firmly. He stepped out, a confused hand still in plain view. She circled him slowly, like inspecting a stranger who didn't quite belong. "You fit the description of someone involved in a robbery earlier this morning," she said. "I've been at my mother's house all day." "You can ask her," Derek replied, trying to stay calm. She didn't answer. She called for backup. And just like that, a quiet homecoming had turned into something else, something too many black men have known in this country. He wasn't scared. He was tired. Tired of proving who he was. Tired of being rewritten in someone else's report. What Officer Delacroix didn't know was that this man she pulled over, this calm, well-dressed visitor with a bag of cookies in his front seat, was not someone who would quietly disappear into the system. This time the story was going to be different, and she had just pulled over the wrong man. Derek's palms rested on the hood of the cruiser, the metal hot beneath his skin. The Georgia sun beat down without mercy. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, still confused and calm, as Officer Karen Delacroix frisked him like he was a threat. "I'm a business consultant," he said quietly over his shoulder. "I work with Fortune 500 companies. I don't carry weapons. I don't use drugs. I don't have anything you're looking for." "Don't talk," she snapped. "You're only making this worse for yourself." Another cruiser pulled up behind them. Officer Hernandez stepped out, young, cautious, maybe just a few years on the job. Karen walked over to him, briefing him in a hushed tone. He looked uncertain, like something didn't sit right, but he didn't say a word. Karen returned eyes cold. Without hesitation, she pulled out the cuffs. "On what charge?" Derek asked, keeping his voice level. "Resisting arrest," she said. "I didn't resist. I asked a question." Derek replied, his brows furrowed. "That's not resistance. You just didn't like my tone." Her jaw tightened. She said nothing, just turned him toward the back seat of her car and pushed him inside. As the door closed behind him, Derek sat back, staring straight ahead. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably his mother wondering where he was. The milk and cookies sat melting in the front seat of his rental, alone in the sun. He wasn't afraid. He'd seen worse. But he was tired of this same script playing out, tired of being forced to prove his humanity to someone in a uniform who wouldn't see it. At the station, the walls were cold and sterile. The smell of bleach clung to the air. A clipboard was shoved in front of him. No explanation, no phone call, just silence. Karen sat at her desk, typing out her report like she'd done 100 times before. Suspect displayed aggressive tone, non-compliant, raised voice, made sudden movement toward officer. But this time something felt different. Derek hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved toward her. He'd looked her in the eye and told the truth, and that unsettled her more than she expected. Still, she signed her report, filed it, and handed him over for processing. No phone call, no answers, just a hard bench and a buzzing fluorescent light above his head. Derek leaned back against the wall, wrists sore from the cuffs, his thoughts racing, not with fear, but strategy. This wasn't a corporate boardroom, but his mind worked the same. He analyzed, he prepared, he remembered every detail, because he knew how systems worked and how they broke people who didn't know how to push back. The next morning, a little after 7, the cell door creaked open. A graying officer stepped in with a clipboard and a reluctant expression. "You're being charged with obstruction and resisting arrest. Your bail hearings this afternoon," he said. Derek looked up. "I didn't obstruct anything. I didn't resist. I was pulled over for no reason." The officer shifted, visibly uncomfortable. "That's all in the report. I'd like to see that report. You'll need your attorney for that." "Then I want to call one." They gave him one phone call. He dialed Marvin Bexley. It had been years since they last spoke, law school late nights, studying long talks about justice and race, and how the law often forgot who it was supposed to protect. But Marvin answered on the third ring. "Marv," Derek said, voice low. "It's Derek. I need your help." "I'm already on my way," Marvin replied. "Just sit tight. I've got you." By early afternoon, Marvin walked into the station in a crisp navy suit and a look that said, "Don't test me." His calm demeanor didn't hide his purpose. Officer Delacroix watched him approach, something tight turning in her chest. "I'm here for Mr. Rowe," Marvin said evenly. "I'd like to see the arrest footage. The incident report." "That's internal," Karen replied, tapping her fingers on the desk. "It'll be released to the court." Marvin leaned forward just enough. "If your story holds up, I imagine you won't mind a little daylight on it." She didn't answer. 2 hours later, Derek walked out on bail. Marvin stood beside him. Karen watched them go, something churning in her stomach. He wasn't loud. He didn't threaten or curse or spit on the floor like others had. He was composed, resolved. That night, Karen sat alone in her apartment, report open on her lap. The words read like every other time, scripted, safe. But something didn't sit right. She opened her laptop and played the dash cam footage. She watched herself bark orders. She watched herself shove him. She didn't like what she saw. She closed the lid quietly and walked away. Across town, in a small rental near downtown, Marvin and Derek sat with open files and cups of coffee. "She's done this before," Marvin said, flipping through documents. "It's a pattern. 2 prior complaints. One sealed, one dismissed. Both from black men. Both nearly identical." Derek leaned in. "I'm not letting this go." "You sure, dead sure," he said. "People like her count on us staying quiet. I'm not built for that." Marvin nodded. "Then we start with a subpoena for the footage. First thing tomorrow." At that same moment, Karen sat behind the wheel of her cruiser, the next morning badge on her chest chin held high. But something was different. Doubt. For the first time in years, it followed her into every call, every stop, every side eye from the officers she used to laugh with. She told herself she'd done the right thing, that Derek was just trying to make a name for himself, that Marvin was fishing for attention, but the weight on her shoulders said otherwise, because deep down she knew this time she'd pulled over the wrong man, and everything she thought she could control was starting to slip. The courthouse in Bibb County wasn't much to look at, just a long beige building with thick windows and the weary air of too many stories stacked on top of each other. It had seen bitter divorces, custody battles, land disputes, and more broken promises than anyone could count. But it was about to hold something heavier, the truth about what happened on Pine Street and what had been happening for far too long. Marvin filed a motion to suppress Officer Karen Delacroix's report, citing inconsistencies between her written statement and the dashcam footage. Alongside that, he submitted a formal complaint requesting a full investigation into her conduct. The court set a date for a preliminary hearing 2 weeks away. Karen was sitting in her cruiser when she got the news. The court notice lay folded in her lap as the police radio chattered softly in the background. Her throat tightened. It wasn't quite fear, it was pressure. That kind that builds behind your eyes when something you buried starts to rise back up. She folded the paper, put the car in drive, and didn't say a word. Meanwhile, back in Marvin's office in Augusta, Derek sat surrounded by files and fragments of the past. Newspaper clippings, public complaints, body cam transcripts, each one bearing some connection to Delacroix. Marvin handed over a thin yellowed article from 2019. "That her?" he asked. Derek nodded, his jaw tight. "College-bound kid, 18, fit the description, ended up with a broken wrist. No charges ever filed," Marvin added. "Family didn't press, no lawyer. He just wanted to be left alone." Derek shook his head slowly. "That ends here." What neither of them knew was that someone else had been quietly watching the case unfold. Her name was Raina Blount, a court clerk who had grown up in the very same neighborhood where Karen Delacroix first began her patrols. Raina remembered those days. She remembered how certain kids, mostly boys, who looked like her brother, were stopped again and again for nothing more than walking home after school. She remembered the time her brother Andre got picked up at 17, charged with obstructing a public officer, even though all he did was ask why he was being questioned. Same language, same badge. So when she saw Derek Rowe's name on the docket tied to an arrest by Officer Delacroix, something inside her shifted. She didn't go to the press. She didn't talk to the department. She called Marvin. They met after hours in the quiet corner of a diner near downtown, where the buzz of the soda fountain was the only background noise. "I know what she's been doing," Raina said, her voice steady. "And I'm not the only one," Marvin leaned forward. "Are you willing to talk? I'll testify," she said without hesitation. "I'll say everything I've seen and heard. The files we were told to log and forget. I kept copies, names, dates. She's been protected for too long." Derek, sitting beside Marvin, studied her carefully. "Why now?" Raina met his gaze. "Because I should have spoken up 5 years ago, and I'm tired of feeling like I helped cover it up." Her words hung in the air like smoke, quiet but impossible to ignore. Marvin gave a small nod. "All right, we'll file a motion to include your statement." That same evening, Karen pulled into her driveway. The porch light flickered overhead. The street was quiet. She slipped out of her uniform and sat down on the couch with the TV remote in hand. When she turned on the news, her breath caught. "Officer under misconduct inquiry after questionable traffic stop." Her name scrolled across the bottom of the screen. She turned the TV off. The next morning at roll call, she felt the shift in the room. Officers who once smiled at her now kept their distance. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Even Hernandez, the young officer who'd backed her up on Derek's arrest, barely offered a nod. Her supervisor called her into his office. "We're placing you on restricted duty," he said in a low voice. "Until the hearing." Karen stiffened. "I followed protocol. We'll let the court decide that." She walked out of the room slower than she came in. Something had changed, and she could feel it. The badge on her chest suddenly felt like a question mark instead of a shield. By the end of that week, Derek's story was everywhere. Local radio, social media, and headlines split down the middle. Some painted him as a professional, a son visiting his aging mother, wrongly accused, and quietly strong. Others clung to the old narratives, non-compliant, agitated. Maybe not quite the man he seemed. In the heart of town at Dee's Barbershop on MLK Boulevard, the debate was louder than usual. Clipper blades buzzed while older men weighed in. "I know," Derek once said. "Grew up 2 houses down from his mama. That boy's never caused trouble in his life." But a younger voice pushed back. "Cops don't pull you over for nothing." To which an elder replied, "Son, you're too young to remember when they did it all the time and didn't even pretend to have a reason. In church basements, in school break rooms, people talked." A retired mechanic named Wallace came forward. "She did the same thing to me," he told Marvin, wringing his ball cap in his hands. Back in 2014, I was walking to my car after a late shift at the warehouse. She said I didn't move fast enough. Next thing I know, I'm face down on the hood. Never told anyone. Figured it wouldn't matter. Would you be willing to put that on record? Marvin asked gently. Wallace hesitated. You think anyone will listen now? Marvin nodded. We only need one crack in the surface. This case, it's the crack. And just like that, the silence began to break. One voice at a time. The town of Macon felt different now. It wasn't anything obvious, not yet. But there was a tension in the air, like the moments before a summer storm. Whispers followed Officer Karen Delacroix wherever she went, and she could feel them on the sidewalk in the break room, even in the checkout line at the grocery store. Folks weren't loud, but they didn't look her in the eye anymore either. The news of her upcoming hearing had made its rounds first quietly, then in headlines. Her name didn't just live on paper now. It floated in the spaces between conversations, passed from one neighbor to another, each one trying to decide what they believed. Karen told herself she could still spin it, that maybe people would come around once they heard her side, that maybe Marvin Bexley was just some slick city lawyer trying to stir the pot. But the faces told her otherwise. At the precinct, things had changed. Conversations stopped when she walked by. Her locker had been moved to the far end of the row, and even though no one said anything directly, the message was clear: she was no longer one of them. Meanwhile, Derek kept to his plan. At Marvin's office, they reviewed every file, every name, every timestamp. Marvin was meticulous. Derek was tireless. They weren't chasing outrage, they were chasing patterns. You think we'll get that dash cam footage in time? Derek asked one afternoon. Marvin nodded. Judge signed the order yesterday. It'll be in the courtroom next week. Derek exhaled, not with relief, but with purpose. Good. I want it to speak for itself. Across town, Raina Blount typed up her signed affidavit. 3 others had joined her now. Wallace, a retired teacher, and another warehouse worker. Each of them described encounters with Delacroix that mirrored Derek's false stops, hostile behavior, intimidation. The town's line between silence and speech had started to blur, but not everyone was ready to hear it. At Dee's barbershop, the Saturday crowd buzzed with divided voices. The old heads sat by the window sipping sweet tea, their words heavy with memory. The younger folks leaned in from the chairs, arms crossed, skeptical. She's been doing this for years, said one of the older barbers. And nobody said nothing. Now one man stands up and suddenly everybody remembers. Or maybe he's just playing it up, a young man muttered from the corner. Trying to get famous. An older customer looked up. Son, when you get old enough to see it happen again and again, and folks still ask for proof, it's not fame. It's exhaustion. Even the churches weren't quiet anymore. Pastors shifted their sermons. School teachers swapped stories and hushed voices in the break rooms. Old wounds that had been neatly tucked away were suddenly back on the surface. Derek's face appeared on the local news, his story recounted with equal parts admiration and suspicion. One outlet described him as a respected professional wrongfully arrested. Another hinted at escalation and disorderly conduct. It didn't matter how calmly he'd acted, some folks would always squint at a black man in a police report and assume the worst. But the town was watching now. One night, Karen stepped into her usual coffee shop. The barista, who had always greeted her with a smile, looked down and murmured, "Be with you in a sec." A couple sitting by the window stood up and left when she stepped in line behind them. Outside, a neighbor who used to wave just pretended to be on his phone as she passed. She told herself it would blow over, but deep down she knew better. Later that week, her brother called from Florida. They hadn't spoken in over a year. "You doing okay?" he asked gently. "I'm fine," she replied quickly. "You sure I saw your name on the news?" "It's just politics," she said. "People trying to make noise." There was a pause. "Just make sure you're telling the truth, Karen. Because if you're not," "I said I'm fine," she cut in. He didn't push, just said goodbye and hung up. That night, she poured herself a drink and sat in the dark, her thoughts drifting back to Raina, the quiet courthouse clerk she had seen eyeing her the week before. There'd been something in that look. A weight. Maybe she knew. Maybe she had something. Files, records, something that could crack all this open. Karen stared into her glass. She wouldn't have let her whole career fall apart over one traffic stop. She'd worked too hard, given too much. But the cracks were showing. At City Hall, preparations were already underway for the preliminary hearing. Marvin's file, now labeled the Roe versus Delacroix, was thick with sworn statements and official documents. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was building something stronger than public opinion. He was building proof, the kind that couldn't be ignored, the kind that might finally force this town to look itself in the mirror. And the question on everyone's mind wasn't just whether Officer Delacroix had gone too far. It was how many times she'd already gotten away with it, and how many people had paid the price in silence. The courthouse was quiet that morning, but it wasn't calm. People filtered in, slowly, neighbors, reporters, city workers, even a few off-duty officers. The wooden benches filled with folks who didn't always show up for hearings like this, but today felt different. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It was about trust history and whose voice got believed when things went wrong. Derek sat at the defense table, calm as ever. His hands were folded neatly in front of him, his expression focused but steady. Marvin stood beside him, flipping through a thick folder filled with sworn statements, time-stamped logs, and court orders. They had done their homework. Across the room, Karen Delacroix sat straight in her uniformed shoulders, stiff lips pressed into a thin line. Her badge still glinted on her chest, but it felt heavier now, more like a burden than a shield. The judge entered with the sharp crack of a gavel. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Judge Bernice Lockwood took her seat. She was older, known for her firm but fair approach. The kind of judge who didn't tolerate theatrics, but who listened carefully. "This is a preliminary hearing to determine whether the charges against Officer Karen Delacroix will proceed to full trial," she said. "We'll begin with the defense's motion." Marvin stepped forward, his voice even and respectful. "Your Honor, we request the court begin with the dash cam footage recorded from Officer Delacroix's cruiser. This video directly contradicts the written report filed against my client, Mr. Derek Rowe." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The lights dimmed slightly. A screen lit up at the front of the courtroom. The timestamp blinked in the corner. The room fell silent. Everyone watched as Derek's rental car came into view. The flashing lights, Karen's voice telling him to step out, her hand resting near her holster. Her tone clipped her words sharp. Then came the moment, the shove. No sudden movement from Derek. No resistance. Just a man standing still, calmly asking why he'd been pulled over. Then the cuffs, then silence. When the footage ended, the room stayed still. Judge Lockwood looked toward Karen. "Officer Delacroix," she said, "is this the interaction you described in your official report?" Karen shifted in her seat. "Not exactly, Your Honor, but at the time, did the defendant raise his voice? Did he lunge at you? Did he threaten you in any way?" Karen's eyes moved first to the judge, then to Derek, then to the floor. "No," she said quietly, "not physically." A soft murmur spread through the room. Marvin rose again. His voice stayed calm, but his words carried weight. "Your Honor, we also have 3 sworn affidavits from other individuals in this community who've had nearly identical encounters with Officer Delacroix. These are not isolated incidents. They form a pattern that for years no one had the platform or the support to challenge." He turned slightly. "Until now." One by one, the witnesses were called. First came Wallace, the retired mechanic. He adjusted his tie nervously and cleared his throat. "She stopped me leaving work one night, said I rolled through a stop sign. I asked her what I'd done wrong. She told me to get out, called for backup, searched my car, didn't find anything, still gave me a citation." Karen didn't look up. Then came the retired teacher, then another warehouse worker. Each story echoed the next, different dates, different streets, but the same voice, the same badge, the same fear. Finally, Karen was called to the stand. She walked slowly, swore her oath, sat with her hands clasped in her lap. Marvin approached. How long have you been with the Macon Police Department? 12 years. In those 12 years, how many formal complaints have been filed against you for? She answered, her voice tight. Do you believe any of them were valid? A pause. No, even this one. Karen hesitated. She glanced at the judge, then at the back of the room where Raina Blount sat watching quietly. Finally, she looked at Derek just for a moment. I believed I was following protocol, she said. But, yes, I was wrong. The courtroom didn't cheer. There was no outburst, just a deep collective exhale. Judge Lockwood called for a recess. Outside, the air was thick with heat and questions. Reporters hovered by the steps waiting. Karen slipped out a side door with her attorney head low. Derek stayed on the courthouse steps saying nothing. He wasn't there for cameras. He just needed the truth to land where people could hear it. When court resumed, Judge Lockwood's voice was calm but firm. I have reviewed the footage, the sworn testimonies, and the submitted documents. There is sufficient evidence to proceed with a full trial against Officer Delacroix for misconduct in falsifying a police report. The gavel came down. The room stirred, but Derek didn't move. He just sat still, eyes forward. Karen stood slowly. Her badge didn't feel like armor anymore. It felt like a memory, something she no longer had the right to wear. Outside headlines formed. News vans rolled tape. Social media buzzed. But Derek didn't need any of it. He didn't come to make noise. He came to make change. And now, for the first time in a long time, someone was finally listening. The verdict didn't take long. 3 weeks after the preliminary hearing, the courtroom in Macon filled once again. But this time there was no tension, no uncertainty. The footage had spoken. The testimonies had followed. What remained now was the reckoning. Karen Delacroix sat in plain clothes, no badge, no uniform, just a navy blazer and a tight ponytail that couldn't hide how pale her face had become. She looked smaller than before, not in stature but in presence. The weight of it all had begun to show. Across the aisle, Derek wore the same calm expression he had carried from the start. His hands rested gently in his lap. He didn't fidget. He didn't smile. He simply waited. Raina Blount sat behind him, along with Wallace and a few others who had come forward. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough, a quiet show of solidarity. Judge Lockwood took her seat and began reading the ruling. Her voice was clear, unwavering. Officer Karen Delacroix is found guilty of misconduct in public office and of filing a false police report. Karen closed her eyes. There will be no jail time. However, she is hereby stripped of her badge and barred from holding any law enforcement position within the state of Georgia. The gavel struck once and the room released a collective breath. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps calling her name. But Karen didn't stop. She didn't look back. She kept her head low and moved quickly toward the parking lot. For years, she'd walked with authority. That day, she walked like a woman who knew the doors were finally closing behind her. Marvin turned to Derek and gave his shoulder a small pat. You did it, he said softly. Derek didn't answer right away. He was staring at the people, the flashing cameras, the quiet ones in the back, who hadn't said a word, but had shown up anyway. I didn't do anything special, he said. I just didn't back down. That night, a local news panel aired a segment titled The Roe Case. A turning point. Legal experts debated what it meant. One called it a wake-up call for small departments that had avoided scrutiny for too long. Another warned that this one win didn't erase decades of silence. Derek didn't watch it. He was on his mother's front porch, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, the kind that had sat in her cabinet since he was a kid. She handed him a plate of buttered toast and sat down beside him. You okay? She asked. I think so, he replied. But it's not really over. She nodded, eyes on the street. No baby, it never is. But this time they had to look. They couldn't ignore you. A kid rode past on a bicycle laughing with his friend. A man walked a dog across the street. Life kept moving, but Derek could feel it. It was moving differently now. A week later, the city of Macon announced a full review of every stop made by Karen Delacroix over the past decade. Internal Affairs sent out notices to over 30 people with past complaints. The mayor released a statement promising transparency. Derek didn't care much for promises. He wanted proof. So he filed a civil lawsuit not for money, but for access. He wanted the records, the names, the documents that told the real story. He wanted it all on paper where it couldn't be rewritten. Karen quietly left town not long after. No statement, no apology. Her house went up for sale. Her patrol car was sold at auction. Her name faded from the news cycle, but not from Macon's memory. At a town hall 6 weeks later, Raina stood at the microphone and spoke for exactly 3 minutes. No one should be afraid to ask why they're being stopped. No one should have to prove they deserve respect, she said. We can't undo the past, but we can stop repeating it. The applause wasn't loud, but it was steady and real. That same night, Derek opened his email for the first time in days. There were hundreds of messages, some from Macon, some from far beyond. Strangers wrote in to thank him, to share their other own stories, to ask what they could do next. He read each one, not because he wanted attention, but because he knew what it meant to feel unheard. And now, for the first time in a long time, people were listening. Months passed. The headlines moved on. But in the quiet corners of town, something had shifted. At Eastside High, a government teacher added the case to her civics unit. At Dee's barbershop, younger men started leaning in more when the elders spoke. And in a church bulletin one Sunday morning, someone had written, "There's power in your voice, even if you tremble when you use it." Derek didn't return to Seattle right away. He stayed. Not because he had to, but because he finally felt rooted. He started attending city council meetings, at first just to observe. But eventually people turned to him. Could he help write a letter? Could he look over a complaint? Could he teach them how to speak up? So he did. Every Tuesday night in the back room of the community center, Derek led a workshop called Know Your Rights. Word spread. Seniors showed up. Teenagers, single parents, even a quiet off-duty cop who always sat in the back and never spoke, but never missed a session either. One night, a 17-year-old named Keon raised his hand. "Did you ever want to just give up?" he asked. Derek paused and smiled. "Yeah," he said, "at a lot of points, but if I had, she'd still have her badge. And I'd still be wondering what might have happened if I hadn't said something." Keon nodded. "Guess we can't let stuff slide anymore, huh?" "No," Derek said, "not anymore." Karen Delacroix never returned to Macon. After the verdict, she slipped out of town without fanfare, no press conference, no farewell. Her house sat quiet for weeks before a for sale sign went up. Her name disappeared from news cycles, but the town didn't forget. Word followed her even in places where she tried to start fresh. Applications ignored. Doors closed. That badge she once wore so proudly now carried a different meaning. It didn't protect her anymore. It kept people away. One night alone in a small apartment 2 towns over, Karen came across a video. Derek's face filled the screen. It was a clip from one of his Tuesday night workshops. He stood in front of a small group at the community center speaking with quiet strength. "Your silence," he said, "can be someone else's permission. But your voice can be the beginning of something that changes everything." She didn't click like. She didn't comment. She just closed the laptop and sat there for a long time staring at nothing. At the barber shop, the younger men listened more carefully. At the courthouse, clerks paid closer attention to what passed across their desks. In classrooms, Derek's case became a conversation about rights, about truth, about what happens when someone stands their ground. Derek never asked to be a leader. He didn't seek attention, but when people began turning to him, he showed up. Not with speeches, not with noise, just with presence. Tuesday nights at the community center grew louder with laughter, with questions, with courage. "Did you ever think you'd be doing this?" Marvin asked him one evening. Derek smiled gently. "Never planned it," he said, "but I figured if we don't teach each other how to stand, who will? Sometimes the world doesn't change with a headlines or a verdict. It changes quietly when one person refuses to stay silent. When one voice, steady and clear, breaks a pattern that others were too tired or too scared to challenge. This story isn't just about justice. It's about resilience, about the strength it takes to be kind in the face of cruelty, to stay calm when you're misunderstood, and to keep showing up even when the system wants you to disappear. Because truth doesn't need permission to matter. It just needs someone willing to tell it out loud. If this story touched you, if it made you feel something true, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share your reflections in the comments below. Let's keep these conversations alive. And if you'd like to hear more real human stories, like Derek's stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet strength it takes to be heard, feel free to subscribe. No pressure, my friend, just a warm invitation from one heart to another.